Welcome to the Big Ideas in App Architecture podcast. I'm your host, Tim Vale, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Mike Boufford, CTO of Greenhouse Software. Welcome, Mike. I'm very excited today to have Mike Boufford on the Big Ideas in App Architecture podcast. Really actually been looking forward to this for a couple weeks. I know you and I met, I don't know, was it a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and kind of did a prep call. And I thought that conversation was super exciting. You've obviously got a really exciting background, done some amazing things. So I'm excited to kind of talk to you today. Instead of trying to read your background to you, just tell us a little bit about how we got to this point, who you are. Obviously we don't spend the whole podcast there, but tell us a little bit about your journey, where you started and how you got to be where you are today, which we want to spend a lot of time talking about.
I was born in New York City. I grew up around the Boston area, and I had really sort of lucky timing, I think, in my life. I turned 13 in 1995, which was really like the dawn of the web. I eventually linked up towards the end of high school with some other programmers, and we started making things and dreaming of making different types of companies. And so right after high school, I actually went and started a couple of businesses, both of which, businesses might be an exaggeration, but a couple of companies that were technically incorporated and all of that, that were trying to solve different problems around the year 2000.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And maybe just noting, I guess, one was trying to integrate bike maps with regular maps. So you remember like back then in 2000, you had MapQuest.
Yeah.
You would print out the MapQuest paper and bring it with you. It was
exactly you did have to do that. That's right. You had to print it all out and staring at this sheet as you drive. Right. I remember that. Yes.
Yeah. You might bring some Scotch tape and tape it to your dashboard so you understood exactly where you needed to go. So I was trying to integrate bike maps. And so Google, of course, did this in 2010. And it was a feature of Google Maps, but I was trying to make that a company. My business model did not exist. I just thought that would be cool. Turns out it would require a lot of money to make and would probably make no money. So ended up failing in that one. Did my first stint at a big company, first and only stint at a big company at Thomson Reuters, a 55,000 person global megacorp. Worked there for a while. Learned a ton about scaled up problems of different sorts, and realized I'm still a startup guy. I'm going to go and join a smaller startup. So I met the co-founders of Greenhouse and spent a little bit of time with them, and took the dive and became their first engineer a little over 10 years ago.
You were their first engineer?
Yeah, I wrote the first lines of code. The company didn't officially have a name yet. They hadn't closed their funding round. I remember when I was about to quit my job, I'm like, so you just haven't closed your round yet. I'll be your first employee. What happens if you don't, in terms of me being paid if I quit my job? And they're like, we'll figure it out. We'll pay you. So I was just like, okay, fine. So I quit my job and went and started Greenhouse.
That's awesome. Well, that's the fun part about it, right? Is starting, when it's so small, the whole world is your oyster. I think it's so exciting. So what is your role today? And then do tell us, obviously I know Greenhouse very well, which we're going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to ask for a favor. But tell the listeners what your role is and what Greenhouse is today. Cause I think it's a really neat thing. We're huge users of it, obviously, at Cockroach.
Sure. So I'm the CTO. I've kind of been head of engineering with a few different titles over time, but I've been CTO of the company, steering the technical ship. I've also worn a few other hats since I've been there forever. So I ran customer support for a while and professional services and product and design. And, you just kind of have to do whatever you got to do, when you're at various stages of the startup life cycle. What Greenhouse is, we're, I think, about 900 people now. We are, I think we're well past it now, but we had a press release, which I know I can reference, about a year and a half ago, where we'd crossed the $100 million of ARR mark. So it's kind of an at scale startup, which is really great. We were ranked number one best place to work.
No kidding.
I think by Fortune magazine, just this year, and have had number one best place to work from Glassdoor and a bunch of other things. So it's a really sort of positive work environment generally.
That's awesome.
And that's really great. And then in terms of what we do, we make hiring software. And so that covers everything from going to find candidates and bring them into your pipeline, running a thoughtful, structured interview process, ensuring that the things that you institute are sort of operationally effective and scalable,
Sure.
that they, we take DE&I into account in terms of how we build our products, all the way through employee onboarding. And so getting somebody ramped up. So we cover tons of different problems across that spectrum.
Yeah, so we, at Cockroach Labs, obviously growing startup, and not quite as far along, although yesterday, ironically enough, we did celebrate our 8th anniversary at Cockroach, and I've been there 4 years, so it's been kind of an interesting journey to see it grow. But we've been big greenhouse users, and obviously as a growing company, we've been hiring a lot. And so we use it, I think, to kind of do all of our, we may use it more, but the way I interact with it is certainly for the hiring process, the review of candidates, et cetera, et cetera. And the favor I'm going to ask of you is, our chief people officer runs a very tight ship in terms of, you interview a candidate, you got to get your feedback in under a certain SLA. And I think I may be the worst in the company at this. We're encouraged to write kind of very, very lengthy notes, which is appropriate, and get them in a certain amount of time. And I am absolutely horrible about it. So I was hoping maybe now that I have like this inside track at technical leadership at Greenhouse, you can like alter the code somehow so that like if Tim Vale submits his feedback, it doesn't register or notify our chief people officer that he's way past the SLA. Because I spent a lot of time in there writing feedback, but I almost never get it in on time. So
I will certainly spend a bunch of time talking to the product team about that. I think fantastic idea.
Yeah,
I'm glad I came on the podcast and heard that. Might change the course of the business, for the better. But yeah, there's like accountability stuff in there, right? Like you're supposed to do certain things, and that's a good example of it. But do you feel guilty? Because that's probably part of it. It's like you should feel guilty if you don't do it. You said you were going to do, right?
I do. There's a lot of guilt associated with it, which I don't need more guilt. So I just somehow, if I could, at some point, I'll get to the point where I do these things on time, of course, but. So we're in the big ideas in app architecture podcast, which I guess means we should attempt at least to talk about not only big ideas but architecture as well. Maybe let's talk a little bit about kind of how you've built. You were the first engineer. How have you built a greenhouse? How is what does it look like today? And maybe be interesting. Given the length of time you've been there, how does the architecture evolve? Because you guys are doing a ton of stuff. You shared with me previously some pretty interesting facts and figures about how much usage there is. I'd love to hear just kind of how the tech stack, the architecture, if you will, has kind of evolved over time. I'd imagine you've seen lots of changes.
Yeah, we definitely have. I think there are probably specific things that we needed to figure out that informed the architecture more than anything else. So one of them was, how do you add customers indefinitely to a SaaS application? Because that's a business critical problem. If you hit some vertical scaling limits and you no longer feel like you can add more customers, the business basically grinds to a halt and it stops. And so this was like one of my great fears as Greenhouse was coming up, that we wouldn't quite figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
And the types of solutions you often have to implement to be able to add more customers kind of indefinitely often do take a while. Like they're architectural. They're like fundamental changes to how you organize and run your systems. And so I wound up going on a little bit of a SaaS CTO tour. I chatted with a bunch of the venture capitalists who had invested at different points, and they made some intros to other people who were further along. And I asked them, like, how did you scale? How did you architect stuff? So sort of like my own personal podcast with all of these luminaries who kind of knew what they were doing. And what I realized was, there is no one size fits all problem, fits all solution for scaling up. But SaaS businesses tend to have a really good sort of shard key baked in, which is that you can separate organizations from each other. Organizations generally don't need to or want to know any of the information about another organization when they're using the application. It's just them. So that meant that we could separate people out into separate databases, and that created a path forward. So we took a really sort of blunt approach and said, let's make a greenhouse. So, a greenhouse having, search capabilities and caching and queues and web servers and a database and all of those things. And let's print sort of copies of them. and make sure that we have services or other sort of data exchange protocols in place where we do actually need to share data, but most of the time we know we won't need to. And so if you look at today, we have 8 different silos, which is what we call them, that contains separate sets of customers, and that allows us to keep adding customers indefinitely, which is good. We figured out that we could use this is actually kind of an interesting goal setting insight. We could use the amount of revenue we were generating as a good sort of trigger. So it was like, after X number of dollars, you kind of need another silo. And so you need to spin that up. And that allows you to also manage cost in a relatively consistent way as you continue scaling. Other nice things about that style of architecture is that when there's a failure, most of the time the failure is isolated. And so, even with HA, everything, you still end up introducing issues. And so that architecture allows you to, let's say, deploy to one silo, see if things are going well, sort of blue-green style, and then, roll out to everyone else. When something happens, a queue gets backed up, it gets backed up in one place. And so there's almost never anything that grinds the whole system to a halt. It would have to be like DNS level or, something even more catastrophic,
Now, and I wonder if you get this sometimes when talking about architecture. I've certainly been, involved in plenty of conversations where, and maybe it's not architectural necessarily, but kind of the word silo, people like, what are you siloing? I think in some levels that almost has kind of a negative connotation. I mean, the way you explained it, obviously,
who likes grain,
makes total sense, right?
Grain, forget grain.
Yeah. But do you get that at all? I mean, it's like, hey, wait a minute, wait, Mike, you mean your architecture's siloed? What does that mean? You're not sharing? Does that mean, it's inefficient?
I think it's sort of like a bleed over in terms of, people hear, I think the engineers feel siloed or design is siloed from product. But, I think it's just sort of a different use of the language. Yeah. And, in our world, it does mean separateness, but separateness is good in certain ways. For this type of architecture. And I agree that it's often bad when you have certain roles that are siloed from others and they're not collaborating effectively. So, it could mean both. Now,
obviously, at Cockroach, part of our big story is, resilience. And, one of the things that we always talk about is survive anything. So, that whole kind of theme is important to us. I actually really, though, like this idea that kind of a small blast radius, right? Should something happen. So if one silo goes down, it doesn't impact the rest of the business. I'm curious, and obviously no need to give specifics, but what does it mean? I mean, if a customer's silo, if you will, is offline, I mean, what's the impact to the business? Is this, fire alarms ringing everywhere? Walk us through, if you can, like what happens if things were to go down? And maybe you're fortunate and they haven't. But what does happen if things go down?
Yeah, things don't really, sort of fail all at once so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at least 4 nines of uptime generally. Discrete things happen though that might make it feel like it's not working the way that you want it to. And so, when that does happen in a given silo, given that silos are actually still quite big, the impact actually is significant. There's a bunch of customers who might be, frustrated when something bad happens. A queue gets backed up and something's not getting processed in a timely manner, some other sort of underlying issue. So we have a fairly robust sort of incident management process, and we have tons of automations around it. A lot of it's driven off of Slack. And so I know you can just buy tools like this now. You would type in a Slack command to start an incident, and it would automatically create a Zoom room that would be recorded. It would invite all of the right people who are on rotations into a shared channel. It would put notifications in different places so that there was high visibility. It would automatically log an entry. So all that sort of stuff happens, and you have a bunch of people sort of swarming it. No matter the hour, although almost nothing is sort of happening in the middle of the night anymore, which is fantastic because, in the early days, it was like me with a backpack and, wherever I went, and in the middle of the night, I need to leave my ringer on just in case.
Interesting on that particular topic. We did a webinar not so long ago with, he works for us now, but at the time, this gentleman, Sean from DoorDash. And I think we used the term in the webinar, what do you do when things go bump in the night? And I thought his response was a really interesting one I never thought about. Is that, like, for example, at DoorDash, they were less concerned about what happens at night, a bump in the night. They were more concerned what happens during the day, like, hey, it's peak hours, middle of the day. What happens if failure occurs then? Because it can, at that time can be, quite costly. If it happens in the night, hey, maybe nobody's looking. That's okay. But you don't want it to, you don't want it going down when everybody's trying to get their feedback in.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective. We do have a bunch of customers in Europe, Asia, and so it's daytime somewhere,
it's daytime somewhere. That's right.
But of course, it's always worse in the US. So yeah, when something happens, we kind of swarm it, and I think importantly, not everybody freaks out. So you said like our fire alarms going off, like they're the alarms that get people into the room. But the important thing is that everybody stays sort of cool, calm, and collected, and is able to carefully and rationally figure out what's going wrong, identify the issue, and work on figuring out what the solution space looks like and apply the change. And so, most of the time issues can be resolved really quickly. You realize exactly what it was. You have a bunch of mechanisms like, rollback in place. If there were some type of code change that caused the issue, we have, certain patterns where, we know that we can auto scale up, certain resources if something's happening. But there are other times where you actually have to do something a bit, that requires deeper research or a more fundamental or lower level change.
Do you ever get worried?
That requires cool, calm energy in order to figure out.
Do you ever get worried? It's like, kind of one of the first engineers, there's going to be some issue and they're going to go back in the Git blame history and they're going to say wait a minute, this is Mike's code. Mike did this. So they ever
they have done that. Now most of my code that could cause issues has already been replaced by better code, I think. So I probably wouldn't get blamed anymore. But even if I did, I think that's fine. I mean, we generally do the thing that I think most tech companies do, which is like we have a blameless culture. We
of course
blame. If we blame anything, we're blaming the process or the guardrails,
sure.
And trying to iterate on the environment that people are developing software in, and not getting too caught up on the individual developer, because writing software is really complicated.
It is so hard. I mean, we say a lot to hear nothing is easy, nothing. Out of curiosity, how big is the engineering team?
So in total, I think I just saw yesterday, it's like a 145, wow. And that's not including like product and design and all of those folks. In terms of people really actively working on the product, I think it's probably a little over 100.
How often are you guys releasing?
Many times per day.
Really?
So last year, I think we did something like 1,200 releases. So that's an indicator. We have full, continuous integration, continuous delivery. We've had those pipelines in place. We really invested in developer tooling pretty early. And so if we go all the way back to the beginning, like a lot of companies that were started in 2012, we were able to use Heroku, and we were all like, oh my God, this is so great. You can do all of these things super easily that would have been pretty hard in the past. And so I think Heroku, did an amazing job of innovating, but they also wound up doing things like pricing their databases like 6 times more than Amazon. And so eventually everyone was like, I guess we gotta go. And so we got on the same boat, but we didn't want to give up all those capabilities. So again, not all that uncommon at that moment, but in like 2015 or 2016, as we're migrating off, we wound up building similar types of tools in-house so that developers could scale up and down, servers or workers, or provision new things. And that tooling ultimately led to us releasing a capability around ephemeral environments in, I think it was early 2016. So, we were the only startup I knew of at the time that had these ephemeral environments. Somebody makes a new pull request, and bam, they could put something, on That's a server, awesome. In a clean state right away. That was all containerized, and be able to promote it all the way through. And that also provided, I think, a nice level of encapsulation.
Sure.
Because the interface that we provided, that was our Heroku-like interface. We actually ended up calling it Dijoku, because the original version of Greenhouse's name was Dijoko, Dan John Company. They picked a name to change. They were like, let's pick a bad name. And so it's kind of like a play on those words. But we were able to swap out the back end, like go from Mesos and Marathon to Kubernetes, and adopt sort of more modern practices as we went, without having to change the interface that developers got used to.
I do have a technical follow-up question, but since you mentioned names, and we're named after a pesky little bug, and people, I swear, to this day are like, why did you do this? What is the story behind? I mean, obviously you just shared kind of what the original name was, but the name Greenhouse, is there a kind of a story behind it?
There is. So the co-founders of Greenhouse, as part of their sort of painted door experiments of like, let's see if this idea is valid and test it out there, they wound up creating a structured hiring class at General Assembly. And so this was in like, late 2011, early 2012. I think it was called How to Make Hiring a Strength of Your Company. And it was really well attended. And one of the people who attended was a person who specialized in naming things. Like that was literally her job. She was like ran a sort of brand consultancy that focused on like picking names for products. And she had met Dan and was like, "You seem really good at business stuff. Can we trade?" And so she proposed, "I will help you name your company, and you give me some business advice for how to scale up my brand company." Okay. So she created this whole deck, which I actually ended up reviewing. Like I think maybe it was a month into Greenhouse while they were still picking the name, and they went through the whole story of like, well, you can do like a really literal name, like Jobvite or job this or snag a job. Hot right jobs. There. Yeah, exactly. You know exactly what it is, and it's very clear, no ambiguous, no ambiguous naming. Or you could go with something really abstract like Altria. It's like they don't sound like a company that might be killing everyone, but they might be, right? And so you have no idea what they're doing. Or you can try to pick a name, that evokes a certain type of emotion, but is founded in a real word. And so, like, what are the things that people feel and think about when they think about hiring? It's like, well, it's growth. It's like the next stage of my career. It's that things might be a little sunnier, right? So you can think of a lot of
hope springs
sort of brand associations from Greenhouse with getting a new job or hiring or growing, and so that became kind of the core of it.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, that's actually kind of an uplifting positive. I love the visual imagery of that. I mean, unfortunately, when we have to describe our name, we have to talk about
so something I'll give you one sidebar story. People. That was a little bit technical. So one of the things in that brand deck was, well, you could also use this sort of plant theme to name future products, and so you could create new products like Greenhouse Rose or Greenhouse, oak or whatever it was. And so I thought, oh, that's really interesting and, clever. We should probably do that. We didn't end up doing that broadly, but one of the first things we needed to name was an API that we created so that people could do data migrations and pull their data out, if things hadn't worked out in the early days. And so I wound up naming it Harvest. And so you could harvest all of your data. It wound up being the name for, the API more broadly and all of the stuff that we dangled off of it. But a bunch of other ATS companies wound up creating Harvest APIs as if this was like a type of API as opposed to a name completely made up off of the Greenhouse brand. And so occasionally, customers will get on and say like, do you have a Harvest API? As if it's like a first-class citizen of the API world.
That's so funny. Yeah. I mean, again, being named after a bug, we celebrated our 8th anniversary. And so there's kind of like a lot of reflection and at Cockroach, everything is named after the bug, right? Or some part of the bug. So, like cockroaches, as they grow and mature, it's called molting. So in our onboarding process, right, you don't, I don't know what it's called at other places, but we molt. And when we get together, it's a roach fest and we have Camp Roach. And it's just so, we don't have this like positive. I mean, I love it. Of course.
We call it onboarding.
Yeah, we don't. It's molting.
And when we get together, we call it like gather or something like that.
I like it.
But yeah, positive brand associations are good.
Speaking of APIs, and I know you and I touched on this a couple weeks ago, but if you don't mind, I'd love to just kind of revisit this topic just because it's always been kind of an interesting topic for me. Architecturally, as I'm sure you're well aware, the industry for many years just fell head over heels in love with this idea of microservices, nanoservices, probably better than anybody, the kind of the lure of converting your application to these kinds of concepts. What's been your take on that? And as you guys have evolved the architecture over the last couple of years, are you a big microservices shop? Can or should you
Yeah,
admit that?
I would say that I am fundamentally not dogmatic and don't get into the religious discussions about these types of things or get super into whatever the trend is.
Yeah.
There are times when microservices are absolutely the right approach. There are times when it's not worth the overhead, and so ultimately you want to sort of understand like what is the business justification for any significant technical change, and what is the cost associated with with whatever the thing is. And so in certain cases, it makes a lot of sense to have something across an HTTP boundary. And other times, you really just want isolation, and actually, it's only a hindrance or slows things down to have something go over a network. Forget HTTP specifically, but go over a network to make certain types of requests. And so there should be a reason that you need separateness. Do you need separate scaling? Do you need your test suite to run a lot faster? Is it going to change frequently? And one of the justifications people often end up using, which I think is sort of incomplete, is we need teams to be able to operate independently. You can do other things, even around a monolith, in order to make them operate independently. You can, assign components and make sure that there's strong component ownership. It doesn't have to be across a network boundary. It doesn't have to be a totally separate code base that's deployed separately. And people can still be pretty productive. Other teams can pull requests in just the same way. So I think a lot of the underlying patterns of we should have isolation so that teams can have a high level of ownership can be achieved without microservices being an architectural constant in how you build everything. The costs, of course, if you have many databases, that are all small, you have to maintain many databases. Anytime you want to join data from one thing to another, that also requires, that you do a bunch of extra work when you're setting across databases where you might just write in a join. If you are on the same database. And so you have to monitor all the services separately. They're going to be finicky in their own ways. So there are times when it's good and times when it doesn't make sense. Yeah, for us, we have like a monolithic core with a bunch of microservices around it. And I remember hearing a story. I'll just give you one, which was from, I will just not name the company, just not to cause issues. But there was a company that was doing a bunch of development in New York and had like 1,000 engineers working, not even an exaggeration. And their main thing was convert the code base from monolith to microservices. And that was kind of like the goal. 6 years worth of work with no new features. This is like ultimately what happened. So did it scale? Yeah, and it was, architecturally beautiful in certain ways. But ultimately, if you sacrifice 6 years worth of, product development advances, that's quite a big sacrifice. So there has to be a good reason that has to be the solution as opposed to something else. And so I think we should just be pragmatic when we make these decisions.
That's why one of the reasons I've so enjoyed talking to you, these last couple of weeks is that, like this idea of pragmatism, right? Not being so dogmatic, because you're absolutely right? I mean, some of these things do have this like religious fervor around them. And, in my role, both at Cockroach and in previous lives, you end up working with companies of all shapes and sizes and engineering teams of varying levels of sophistication and maturity. And it is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who, read a blog or go to an event and like, we're going to adopt this technology come hell or high water, because it's the thing to do right now. And oftentimes, maybe not as much attention is paid to, what does this actually mean to the business? Can I or will I achieve like actual goals when going down this path? And that story that you just shared does not surprise me. We used to run into folks all the time and still do to some extent who are, just hell bent on some technology or some architectural concept, regardless of how well it works for them, because it's like perceived as the thing to be or thing to do.
Yeah, and I think the best developers really understand what are the costs and value associated with the decisions they're making, and when they do fully understand that and they try to vet it out, I think that should provide a more skeptical lens on certain types of sort of new hot technologies. Also, just being around for a while and seeing all of these waves where it's like, if you're not doing things in a spa, then you clearly have the wrong architecture. And it's like, well, Again, it depends, right? There are certain things where like, yeah, that was an innovation that, made certain types of applications better. And for other applications, it made things harder and worse and bad. Like, so, we should look at these trends, understand them, not rush and maybe not be first adopters for all of them. And we shouldn't buy all of the value that's being pitched by the zealots who are out there advocating for any given architecture. Most of the time, the consequences show up a little bit later in blog posts like, we switched everything to a spa and our company's dead. That might not be the reason, but like you may have wasted a ton of time as a result because maybe that didn't really solve the problem you had.
That's so funny.
Is the fact that I have 3 little kids and they're constantly sick, and I'm constantly sick as a result. We had to reschedule this, I think, in part because I was sick, and you can probably still hear the end of a cold.
No, you sound great.
Oh, thank you. Even now, but they wake up in the middle of the night when they're sick, and I mostly feel bad for them. When they were doing it every night when they were newborns, I mostly felt bad for me. But at this point, I mostly feel bad for them, like, oh, they're so stuffed up, and try to help them in the middle of the night, but they literally keep me up. Non-literally, I think the same thing that everyone else is dealing with, which is just there's a lot of uncertainty. It's hard to plan during periods of uncertainty. Do we what bets do we place on the future? Is it that we're heading into an economic rebound? Is it that we need to be more careful with where we invest our energies over the next few years, because it could be a long rocky road? Nobody knows. And anyone who says otherwise is obviously full of it. And so that's it doesn't necessarily keep me up at night, but it's a thing I think that everyone, not just across the tech industry, but maybe especially the tech industry is worried about right now.
Oh, couldn't agree more. It's tough out there for us, for everyone. I just woke up this morning and read about more layoffs happening in different corners of the world. So yeah, I think the uncertainty adds just another layer on top of kind of the big fun tension cake or anxiety cake that we all live and deal with every day. But on a more positive note, we'll end with, what are you hopeful for? What are you excited about this coming year?
Yeah, let's see. Maybe I'll give a multi-part answer. So, for me personally, I'm just excited to be sort of like out there in the world so much more. We had newborn twins during pandemic, and I'm fully sort of engaged back out there in the world, and I feel like a tremendous amount of positive energy. There's more travel happening, seeing people. There's actually a really amazing energy, I think, in parts of humanity right now that I think I'm pretty excited about. In terms of work stuff, I'm really grateful to be working for a company that is being conservative and careful, and we're already pretty good at not setting lots and lots of money on fire as we were building the company, and so we have not been feeling like we're in dire straits, despite the fact that the economy sort of is what it is. And I think that's been amazing to feel like the comfort of that. And then, I'm excited to see, how things are meshing with, this generation of the team. We're over 10 years in. Wow. And one of the things we always took pride in is that, people who started working at Greenhouse wanted to stay here long term. Mm-hmm. Last year, out of, all the 140 some odd people that are on my team now, one person left all of 2022.
Wow.
One. And so, just being part of a culture that feels as positive as it does is an everyday gift. I've worked at places where people are, wake up unhappy, and they are unhappy throughout the day, and they go home feeling unhappy. Mm-hmm. And that's generally, I think, is not the case. That people may get a little bit more fulfillment out of their day. They get a lot of kindness and empathy from colleagues, and they get to do good work. So I'm happy to work for a place where all that's true.
Oh, that's awesome, Mike. Well, listen, this was a fantastic conversation. I do so deeply appreciate you spending time with us. Just great stuff, and looking forward to. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to look forward to continuing to add feedback into Greenhouse, but I'll certainly do better next time. And if you can, talk to the engineering team, see if we can get that fixed, so I don't keep getting in trouble.
No problem. We'll just put a string literal right in there. If Tim Vale.
If Tim Vale. No alerting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Mike, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us on the Big Ideas in App Architecture podcast. I'm new to this, so if you have any thoughts or feelings, would like to drop us a line and let us know how we did, I'd love to hear about it. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.